question, and I'm starting with this question because I think Morgan actually answered the question really well, but I wanted to see if Julian, you or Brendan wanted to add to anything that Morgan said. And so this first question is just about the different points of view in the book, in Tommy Orange's book. And so someone asked, why do you think that Tommy Orange used different points of view for each character in there? So like I said, Morgan, I think you did a beautiful job answering the question, but Brendan or Julian, did you have anything else you wanted to add or any different thoughts? Oh.
Yeah,
what is no. I thought Morgan did a great job explaining that. I mean, it's not like it's not ever been done. When I was growing up, I loved reading Faulkner, and it was very confusing. And there's a lot of different characters saying different things, but each chapter has so many little Easter eggs, like. And it's very voicey, and it's very, coming from a river of consciousness, right? A stream of experience, not more than a stream of consciousness, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's also kind of like Pulp Fiction. Also with like the shootout vibe and everything like that too. So yeah, that's my very academic take. And add on to Professor Talty's.
That was a great visualization, actually. When you said that, I remember Pulp Fiction, and I was like, yes, it seems like little scene vignettes or something that are all together. All right. This next question is actually for you, Julian, but of course anyone else can comment. But this is about Tommy Orange's, the way that he writes about the Alcatraz occupation. So for this person, let me just give the kind of like the bit that they said before. They said that in your presentation, they gained a deeper understanding of that occupation effort and a deeper respect for it than they did just reading Orange's novel. They said they never appreciated the Alcatraz occupation as something that was similar to like the Montgomery bus boycott equivalent until today. So they're very thankful. And they're curious about whether or not with your knowledge and experience of that area and that history, whether or not you felt like Orange did, whether or not that his coverage made sense to you, whether or not he did it justice, I guess.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Again, sort of what I was talking about today was some of the political and historical, cultural, sociological, et cetera, background to Oakland as an urban indigenous place and of the Alcatraz occupation. I sometimes make this comparison of the Alcatraz occupation to the Montgomery bus boycott, in part because I think it helps people understand the significance of the occupation. This was a real starting point and turning point in the indigenous rights movement, so to speak, in the United States and more broadly. During the occupation, as I said this morning, President Nixon shifted the stated policy towards American Indians from one of termination, that was the goal, to one of self-determination. Alcatraz is often sort of cited and seen as a starting point for that history, although starting points are obviously complicated in general in histories and narratives and all that sort of stuff. I think that I like what Morgan had to say about the Alcatraz occupation. He was talking a little bit about how in Orange's sort of take on the occupation, and forgive me, it's been like a couple of years since I've actually read the book. Tommy talks about a little bit of the descent of the occupation into, something that maybe if you follow some of the coverage of similar movements might feel kind of familiar. There's these movements that maybe begin with a very idealistic and exciting set of ideas, and then, the reality of trying to house and shelter and feed and, govern yourselves to a certain extent on an island that is, in this case, being surrounded by the Coast Guard, and where you're not welcome, kind of sets in, and there are competing visions for what direction that movement should and will take. There's competing egos and competing political leaders. This was definitely a feature of the Alcatraz occupation. And I think in that regard, I think that Tommy did do it real justice. And I think that, when we talk about these histories, it's important to be able to strike that kind of balance, right? Of the Alcatraz occupation on the one hand is something that should be remembered and celebrated. That was the whole point of all of us gathering around the All Nations drum and singing the American Indian Movement song when I was a kid. The whole point of that was that we were supposed to know and embody and literally like sing, this history as urban Native people growing up in Oakland. And on the other hand, community's messy, right? Because people are messy, and that's the other side of history and truth too. And of course, literature often helps us articulate that as well. So to answer your question, yes, I think you did do it justice. Thank you for the question.
So there were several questions about reconnecting to culture and identity. So I kind of just put them together into one. So in so much of the novel, people struggle with and wonder about their identity. What if you do not have any there, or if you don't know what your there is? So the bigger question is, how do you reconnect to lost culture?
I think it's bad for us to look at each other because we're like, who can talk about reconnecting the best?
Also, there's no obligation to answer any of the questions.
Yeah.
You can just go, that was a good question, and then turn your mic red.
That was a good question.
Excellent question. Best question of the night so far.
I think we should end it there. Yeah, no. I can say,
I mean, we're getting this is a very philosophical question, this is, and we're not rhetoricians, right? We're not gonna dissect words, but we
3-minute sentence committee right here.
yeah, exactly.
You can mad-lib it.
We can manage.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think.
we're all I think it's a good question to ask, and I think it's a good question to kind of answer in a way. I feel like I don't know, it's reconnecting to what was, where you come from. I feel like it's always taken on as a larger thing. How does Indian country reconnect with itself? And really the question is, it's thinking about how do we connect back with, being Penobscot, for example, right? I don't have an answer, but I think it really depends on the community you're from, the blueprint for doing it is never really, it's always different, I think. And it's one that unfortunately people struggle with and are gonna keep struggling with, and I don't know how to fix it. No idea.
Well, there's this idea of the humanism that we're kind of talking about today, right? There's a way to connect with each other that doesn't have to divide us into cultural tropes or into tribes. The society that we live in today benefits very much from dividing us up as much as possible and to throw us into margins, therefore marginalizing us. And another word for margin is a reservation, right? Or a border. Genre, culture, the old ways of what anthropologists back in the day created this idea of what culture is in order to say that is other. So when there's a community that works for you, go after it. Or if there's not a community for you, you can kind of create it. That's all I gotta say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very well put. I would add, just from my own experience and perspective, that literature, reading, writing were honestly a big part of my reconnection or relationship to myself and figuring that all out. I very glancingly talked about this in my presentation, but I grew up in a household with a white mom, where my native dad kind of scrammed when I was a young man, a little boy, and I came out looking the way I looked, so didn't really look like my mom, and that experience of being a little boy named Julian Brave NoiseCat, which is also like they couldn't have named me like a more Indian name, like they put a lot of Indian on that name. And without my dad, and my dad is I guess like a notable Native artist, so I would like run into people around, and they based on my name they'd be like, oh, like I know who your dad is, and all that sort of stuff, and he wasn't around. And so going to places like Tribal Friendship House, learning to dance, going back home to visit family in Cannon Lake, and reading and writing and trying to figure out what it is to be someone who's more than half, less than whole, like kind of in it and of it, but not fully, and to be in that sort of in between space, which I think is not just an Indian thing. I think that like a lot of us find ourselves in those in between spaces, right? I found that art, and in particular literature, reading, writing, trying to understand how other people, including Sherman Alexie for better or worse, wrote about this experience, and read about it and start writing about it myself. I feel like that was an important way of me figuring out not just what my community in there was, but like, I guess in like a broad philosophical sense, like, what is our humanity? What is the thing that like makes us kind of a thing?
And I was gonna add to that, and then I forgot what it was. No. You sparked something in me, and I forgot what it was. It already left my brain. But it had something to do with being lost between worlds, or being bisected, and this idea of being one or the other is also a way of kind of diminishing our humanity. Like if I think in a lot of times in our culture, in the Western culture, we rely on a binary of sorts, right? Everything is a binary. And I think what I was trying to talk about today was like bipolarity is not really a bipolarity. It's not one extreme or the other. It's actually a range. It's a spectrum. And you're feeling outside of those margins that you're supposed to be inside, right? That's scary for some people. But there's not just two worlds that we're being pulled. It's multitudes of, right? We are multitudes, every single one of us. So there doesn't have to be one culture that we're part of, right? Or one culture that we return to. We can kind of create our own in certain ways by taking the good parts of this one, the good parts of this one, and learning from our history, learning from our past, and passing that down to Charlie.
Who?
Your son.
Oh yeah, Charlie, my son, yeah. Definitely will pass it down to him. It is.
I appreciate you all working your way through that question. I am not necessarily naming where the questions come from, but I particularly appreciate you answering that question, because there are folks who are not here in the room with us, who are significantly younger than the people who are here in the room with us. And I don't know if this question came from them or not, but I think just hearing you grapple with it is wonderful, so thank you. All right. Morgan, this is a question for you. So with this momentum growing in Indigenous literature from around the US, have any of these voices or experiences changed the way you hope the next generation, like your son, like your son, Charlie, comes to understand their own history and voice?
Yeah, I hope that, I don't know, I always like, I just want somebody to write like from the Penobscot Nation, sort of like an antithesis to my own work. You know what I mean? Like coming at it from a different way. Like, I mean, it's easy enough to read my collection and be like, oh, this is just the same type of like alcoholism and addiction and stuff like that. But like, if you look closer, like if you look really close, if you're a close reader, you know that the book is actually about love and about like what it means to love one another, right? So I'm not criticizing anybody here who didn't read it that way. But I want like, I mean, it would be great, you know, to have, you know, another Penobscot writer come out, right? And their book be really successful. And then I'm like no longer relevant. Like that's what I want eventually to happen. You know what I mean? Like, cause it's like, you know, they talk about monopolizing markets and stuff like that. And it's like, we have to have voices from everywhere, you know, or else we run into the single story, a TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, I think, right? You know, and it's like, we can't have one story because if we have one story, we're pretty much dead, right? We need multitudes of stories to know who we are. And so
One story is a stereotype, right?
yeah.
It's not that it's not true, it's only one side.
Yeah, how did she say it? Yeah.
A stereotype, it's not that it's not that it's untrue, but that it's only one part of one story.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've made people watch that in my classroom. But no, I think, I don't know, if my son grows up to write a book, hopefully it's like, maybe he'll be a romance writer or something. I don't know, like I just like, you know, I just like have it be something different, you know, and like, yeah, I think I'll end on that note. And the one thing I want to point out for people who have pre-ordered my book and read it and know that the narrator's name is Charles, no correlation to my son. I came up with that name in 2015, my son was born 2023, okay, no, yeah, 2022, right, so, no, 2023.
Insert one.
Yes, 2023. Don't tell my wife this just happened.
Subtract 1 year from now.
All right, this question,
I just wanted to add one
goodness.
quick thing about that is that part of being a part of a literary circle means that you have to support other literary artists. And no matter what, it's not about us, it's about the stories. Sharing the stories is only the one half. I mean, writing itself is only one half of the art creation, right? It's the sharing, we were just talking about this upstairs, it's the sharing of those stories that finishes or completes our what was the word? Catharsis, right? So catharsis isn't actually the process of the art making, right? It's the catharsis is actually the sharing with the audience. That's in the Greek sense of the word. It's what the audience feels from that show, right? From that tragedy. Somehow I don't know where we were, but supporting literary people, like that's what it's all about. I mean, and Tommy's been really good about that.
Yeah, I think people think of artists as these like singular people who are just like in a closet somewhere, you know, like, or in like a basement, or like John Cheever riding his elevator in his business suit down to the boiler room of his like, I don't know, New York apartment complex to write all day, you know. No, like I feel like to be an artist is to be like is really to collaborate and to like be a part of a community, because it's like, I mean, every book, you know, there are brilliant people out there who can write a book and have nobody touch it and you know, it goes out, but there's so many people who play a role, you know what I mean? And it becomes a community aspect of it. Like art isn't a singular thing, I don't think, in my opinion, at least when it comes to writing. There's so many people who play a role in it, and ultimately in the end product, the readers is, I mean, look at, this is an example of it, right? You know, we're here talking about a book that one person wrote who had, you know, support from a lot of people who had readers, you know, who had gone through the AMFA.
I supported him
Yeah.
very early.
Yeah. And so it's like, we have to keep supporting each other to keep this going and keep this existing, which is what we need, you know, to have that dialogue continue.
And part of the program that I went to, the Institute of American Indian Arts Low Residency MFA program, which is an amazing program. And I wanted to mention this in my talk earlier today, and we're talking about tribalism too. I got, as much as I found my people in the restaurant, in the kitchen, that's another tribe that I'm part of. But then there's this writing tribe that I'm part of. And there's my actual Navajo tribe that I want to be part of. And there's my Basham side, right, the white side that I want to be part of. But when I got to IAI, I kind of got everything at once in some ways. And in the Institute of American Indian Arts, where like it sounds really awesome, and it's like exactly as awesome as it sounds. But we didn't have to explain ourselves. We don't have to say this is who we are, this is what we're up to. We can just focus on the art. And that was really, really important for us. That community that we were building is kind of, I like to think of it as another kind of Renaissance, but in the sense that it's a movement. It's a movement, and there's all these wonderful, amazing Indigenous writers going through this program and making great art, and it's a movement, and it's going to continue. And I think that's one of the reasons why we like the classroom, right? Is we're curious beings, and we want to help other people, you know, carry that curiosity on.
Okay.
I'm not speaking for you.
No, I was just gonna ask you if your MFA low res program was full of weirdos as much as mine was. When you go to a low residency MFA, you just become a weirdo. Like that's just what happens. I don't know, take the word as you will. It's just like everybody's weird, like artistic stuff comes out. It's cool.
It's so accepting. So accepting, yeah. But also everyone brought their accents with them too. Like, yeah, I was suddenly my code switching, like I was talking like an Indian. Like I've been living on the res all my life. And like pointing with my lips and shit. And actually that's what there means in Indian is all.
Okay, this question, we'll see. This one, I really like this question and I feel compelled to ask it. So, this is about the book, so it's gonna zoom back into the book. So, and it's about carceral systems. What are the takeaways about non-carceral responses to crime, especially regarding Jackie Redfeather and Harvey? And it's a big question. So if you need a moment, if you have thoughts. And it's okay if you don't. Yeah, so just alternatives to incarceration as a response to crime.
In terms of like
Jackie Redfeather.
yeah,
Harvey.
so instead of alternatives to what we have today, you mean? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Are there any takeaways? So, you know.
I'm in favor, that's my response.
Yeah, I'm in favor of it as well. The unanimous vote.
We should abolish the current justice system that we have and rewrite it. Hell yeah.
Solid. Okay, thank you. So this question actually came up a lot. So I think the person who wrote it for Julian, but maybe that was asked because it was after you were the first person, but I think I've heard this question come up a lot in terms of there. Where do you see hope and forgiveness in the book? For all of you, where's there hope and or forgiveness?
And I see it in the language itself. I mean, most of the book is written, and Tommy's gone on to explain, you know, why he chose to use present tense for most of the story, you know, and I think he had said it was like he chose present tense because how did he phrase it? It was like, I chose present tense because we're present day people or something like that. But I read it that way, but I also just see his use of present tense throughout the book as this like sense of hope, because like to be present is to be hopeful that you'll continue on, you know what I mean? Present tense, you know, for the book to go and work in present tense, or it's tense, there are moments where, you know, the book moves out of that tense, and I'm harping on tense here because it's a deliberate choice he made. And that very point that he keeps it in present tense for so long, and in particular moments of the book, for me, is just, as a reader, I feel it as hopeful, is because it had been in past tense. I don't know how I would have emotionally resonated with how tense then related to character and empathy and all of that. And so I can't not help but read his book as being hopeful, just by the simple decision to use present tense. As for forgiveness, I'll shut up so I can think about that one for a second. Okay, so
I had something and.
You'll find it.
Yeah, I mean, I find hope in the character who chooses to dance is Orville Redfeather, correct? Yeah. You know, that is an experience that I very much identify with. When I was a young, like 10, 11-year-old, I myself chose to have my coming out and become a powwow dancer, and you know, that circle has taken me all across Indian country up to, you know, I've been to powwows everywhere from Enoch, Alberta, Canada, to, you know, the Paula Reservation in Southern California, and Shinnecock Reservation on Long Island, and many, many places in between. And you know, powwow is an interesting thing. I think people might be, especially in this group, surprised to learn that like powwow is not really. It's like a new pan-Indian thing mostly. A lot of the dances have roots and origins in particular dance societies and dances from particular nations. But the powwow celebration itself really sort of comes out of, honestly, like the Buffalo Bill Wild West shows in the late 1800s. And then, you know, beginning in the early 1900s, there were like tribal celebrations that started happening, particularly in the plains, around like Independence Day and things like that. And those became sort of like some of the first powwows. So they are this very like modern, but also traditional phenomenon, and they really spread across the country beginning in the 60s, which is when you get people like native urban Indians in Oakland, you know, dancing in powwows and that sort of thing. And so you know, that was a big part of my life. And, you know, I've had little nieces and nephews and stuff also choose to go into the dance circle. And, you know, I think any kid who gets the courage, or young person or adult for that matter, who gets the courage up to, you know, put together a regalia or borrow someone else's regalia and get out there and dance, you know, that like, I remember the feeling and the fear that came, that I had to overcome to go do that. So I definitely see some hope in that, although of course, you know, it ends in a pretty tragic shoot 'em up kind of twist. And then the forgiveness, you know, I think the overall sort of way in which Tommy writes about all of these characters, I find his voice to be very, you know, people do some messed up and painful and not only messed up and painful, but there's some messed up and painful stuff that's in that book and in Wandering Stars as well. Yet the way that he writes these characters, you know, Morgan talked a bit about voice. I find his voice also to be very like loving and therefore forgiving for people's shortcomings and mistakes.
Just gonna echo the voice aspect. Yeah, it's like, now that you mentioned it, I'm like, that's what I would attach forgiveness to, is like how tender the voice is that Tommy writes with in there. And yeah, I just wanted to cut him off, that's all my.
I agree with everything that Morgan says despite his insults. And there is hope in the language, and there's hope in stories that need to be told, and there's hope because this is in print that this history is saved for now. That this story is saved for now, and that we are present tense Indians. What Tommy has done is given life to something that we have probably known and thought about and live, and try to do in our artistic practice. But then when we see it out there in the world, when I was saying earlier, when I first heard him read sections, how blown away the entire audience was, because it's at IAI and an audience of mostly Indians. And there was so much hope in the room, even though we were all crying. And as for forgiveness, I can't speak much to that. My next book is all about not forgiving.
Brendan, I'm gonna ask you to keep talking for a little bit. This one question is just for you. What does home mean to you, and how does place fit into your self-identity?
I was really hoping that was a Taylor Swift question.
I asked all those, no, I'm just kidding. I don't know her.
I don't It's on my side. Can you repeat the question, please? No, the idea of home. So, like, what do I think?
Yeah, what does home mean to you, and then how does place fit into your sense of identity?
I used to place a lot of importance on place as far as who I am and where I come from, and I guess I still do, but I'm not as it's a hard question to answer, because I do like to live everywhere, and I am a bit of a vagabond, and I used to be a seasonal worker pretty much. And so the idea of what a home is, you know, it is family, and it's the land and the place that I come from, for sure. I think by dealing with the things that I'm dealing with now, just like thinking about mental illness and these things and teaching about it, it makes me realize that, you know, the home is here, right? The home is internal. And yeah, I'm gonna still be searching for that home for the rest of my life. But that's okay. Because it's still in there somewhere. There is a word, couple words that I found in my research about home. And because there's no proper English word that I could find. And so I found one word in Portuguese. I mean, this is a famous word, saudade, is a word that is this longing, S-A-U-D-A-D-E, saudade. And it's kind of this mourning for something, and there's no definition in English, so it's really hard to describe. But that led me to another word that was very similar in meaning. It's Welsh. It's Hiraeth, H-I-R-A-E-T-H, Hiraeth. And that's a word that they use similarly, like saudade, for the sailors who would leave the island, and the feeling that the sailors had of never being able to return home. And if they did, it would be to a home that no longer existed. It's a very, there's no word like that in English, right? And it is a kind of longing for something that no longer exists or never did in the first place. And I think that's kind of how I feel, and I think a lot of Indians feel that way too. notes. Yeah, I think that's about it. I mean, yeah, those words, the third word. So I went to my aunt teaches Dene language and history at Dene College on the res, and so I asked her if there were any similar words, and she said, she gave me this word Ts'ohnii, and Ts'ohnii means in Navajo, it's kind of the depression or the sickness, probably mental illness that the elders suffered from after the long walk. Ts'ohnii. And so I felt like that was similarly, like they were missing the home, that when they returned to it, it wasn't gonna be the same, right? Really bummed you out that time.
No.
Sorry, that's.
Thank you. Well, this was an interesting question. I think it's connected in some interesting way. So, this person writes that one of the speakers mentioned the concept of diaspora in regards to land. And they said perhaps they want you to expand on this or clarify if they misunderstood. They were curious about whether or not there's not really what the sense of diaspora is or diasporic communities are, because all land is indigenous. Is there that sense, or can you clarify? I don't remember if you was.
Yeah, I'm the guilty, I'm the perpetrator here. So in my talk, I talked a little bit, and this was more of a suggestion than like a definitive point about how, the Bay Area and Oakland specifically is a site where Native people are relocated during the Federal Indian Relocation Program. And so what you have in Oakland is largely a Native community that is natives from elsewhere, right? It is not the California Indians and specifically the Ohlone, who are the predominant urban indigenous community, although they are there as well. It is predominantly Native people from other reservations, and historically, although this is a lot less true today than it was even 10 years ago, you're talking about really specifically the people who were part of that relocation and their kids who stayed. As Oakland's actually gotten more expensive and stuff, actually that itself has shifted, and those people are now getting displaced themselves, which is really sad and interesting part of that story. To talk about that, I suggested, in the term indigenous itself, right, it literally means to be like a person from and rooted in a particular place, right? To be native to a particular location on the earth. That's like the dictionary definition of being an indigenous person. And yet what I was getting at is that there is this experience that is actually arguably a majority indigenous experience of people, because 70%, as far as we know, of Native people in the United States live in cities now. The statistics on these things are not super reliable, but that is more or less the statistic as we know it. Now live in cities, right? So you have this phenomenon of Native people moving to cities, sometimes historically through federal programs. And I think that, in some other instances, if we were not Native, you would describe that as a diaspora, right? Like, in the Black world, we talk about the Black diaspora. There's all these sorts of diasporic communities that we talk about in cities and in communities all across the United States. But this is not a word that we often apply to Native people. And so what I was suggesting is maybe this is a term that actually in certain ways makes sense. At the same time as I think, Tommy's novel and very beautifully writes, it's also possible to be one of those Indians whose people are not from Oakland or not from the city, and yet to be indigenous to the city, to have a distinctly Native relationship to Oakland. Although if you say that in front of the people who are from that city, the politics of that statement can get also kind of complicated, right? One of the very interesting lacuna of this history, we talk about the Alcatraz occupation, is, that it was an occupation of historically Ohlone and Coast Miwok lands, right, by Indians from elsewhere reclaiming it. And so now, today, like if you ask a California Indian or an Ohlone person specifically about the Alcatraz occupation, they're like, oh yeah, those people were from somewhere else, and they were like, occupying our land. So the politics of all this stuff can get interesting and complicated to get to the subject of sort of native on native tension, I guess. But that's more than you need for your book club.
All right, for all of you, this is a question about humor. So all of your books and your talks, I think this person was also speaking to your talks, contain humor. How do you manage or think about humor in the middle of such difficult, hard histories and experiences? And I feel like maybe not all three of you, but two of you specifically said something about making a joke about genocide or something like that. So
I missed out.
you can wait, I don't know. You missed.
Now you have to.
I'll think one.
Okay.
No.
So yeah, tell us about humor. How do you manage or how do you think about humor in the context of such difficult stories?
In order to know and experience joy, we have to go through some kind of grief and grieving process. And maybe the opposite is also true. But that's what I've kind of learned, is that the Indians are like the fucking funniest people I've ever met, no matter where you go. They're just, I don't know, they're great, man. They're great. And you only get that from an insider point of view too. But my family especially, they always crack me up. Sometimes that's all you got, sometimes that's all you got. It's just some terrible dad jokes. Or offhand comments about the comedy of genocide.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that the sort of tragicomic style, the dark humor, and just humor in general is really present in Native storytelling and life just generally. I'll say that and in my community and on my res, banter and wittiness in conversation is really important. And if you think about, the fact that my people were pit house people. So in the winter, we spend a lot of time in a pit house, which is like kind of, I guess, not that different from what the hobbits live in, and like Lord of the Rings. Like it's like a round thing in the ground and you go down in it. And a lot of people lived in there, and like it was winter in like, Western Canada, what's now Western Canada. So it's cold. And there's obviously, it's back in the day, so there's no TV, there's no video games, there's no cell phones, there's no none of this. So, and even in my dad's day, right? Like you had to be entertaining, like there wasn't much else to do. So, I think that in that context, like humor is really valued. Like it's something that passes the time. And it's also, in my interpretation and understanding of it, it's also an important way of how you can make the stories memorable so the knowledge itself gets passed on, right? Like people remember good stories, not bad ones. And one of the ways that you can pass on important information is by including it in like a kind of kick-ass story, Otherwise, nobody's gonna remember it. Like some important part of who you are is going to disappear. And then I think there's also some tongue-in-cheek ways that we dealt with the fact that we were facing potential extermination, one of them, in my opinion, is this morning I said Tsq'escen, right? And I said that means good morning, or literally actually it means like you all survived the night. Like that was also a joke about the fact that, there were a lot of us who did not survive a lot of nights, and so it was like this sort of wry thing that we would say to each other in our language that was getting at this really gruesome sociological, historical phenomenon of death, right? That was like wrought upon us.
And we're not the only ones to have suffered who also are very funny people.
Yeah.
Like, let's not be stereotypical here, but yeah, my black friends are fucking hilarious too.
Yeah.
My Jewish friends are fucking hilarious too. Like it's, for some reason, white people are just not that funny.
Thank you for saying that, because when you said that, I was like.
Thank you for saying
Well. I was gonna say, I think my people are the funniest people ever, so, you know. Same. Morgan, humor.
I need to do the joke now.
Yeah.
Knock knock.
A lot of dark humor. Oh. Oh.
You guys asked for a joke and I gave you a dark joke, okay? But to make you actually laugh, the question was about humor, right? I feel like I am really irreverent. Like I laugh at like stuff that like if you saw me laughing at stuff like you'd be like, I find stuff really, really funny. I mean, like I would spend most of the time growing up on the res over here, right? But in the summers, I would go and visit my dad in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And it lived on a dead-end street, and it was in the city, and it was 3 houses, and I can't have that symbolism here or not. It was a red house, a white house, and a blue house, not joking. It was all family, and there was grandma and grandpa, I called them, because I used to live on that road, and my dad had known them, and then my mom had took me in the night and moved me up, came back up here, because of my dad was a bad gambler and a bunch of shit, but anyways, those 3 houses were all related. There was grandma and grandpa, and then right next door was their daughter, their daughter Rita. And then across the street was Lucy, who was one of 3 daughters of Rita. All 3 of them rented out, all the houses rented out rooms to people. And so my dad rented out a room there, and like the room was like a box, and it was just like full of like there was no room like at all. But the people who lived there were like, it was cheap rent, you know what I mean? But like, they were like, there was always drama, okay? So like, there's always something going on. My dad had dentures, and he was an addict, and like, he would fall asleep, and he always wore shirts that had a pocket. And he'd fall asleep, and he never used poly grips, so his teeth would fall and wash them, and they'd fall, and they'd go in his pocket, and he'd wake up. And he'd be like, "Where's my teeth? God damn it!" And he'd be blaming everybody, and I'd be like, "I saw Mickey come in here earlier, and I'd egg him on or whatever, and he'd be like going after Mickey, and and then Mickey would be like, "Why would I have your teeth?" And like, and that sort of stuff. And then we had this one guy, Tim, who was a real bad alcoholic, and he was schizophrenic. He was schizophrenic, but he thought Madonna was his girlfriend. And you can laugh, go ahead. He thought Madonna was his girlfriend, and every year he said she's coming on the 4th of July, and she's in a helicopter, and she's giving everyone $1 million. But every year Mickey was always like, "You're fucking crazy. Why are you? Madonna's not your girl." And he would fight with him for some reason. And he knew better. He would just fight with him, and he always got beat up because he would go down the road and tell people that stuff too. But like for me, like I just grew up around so much dysfunction that like. Everything is, I don't know, it just all became funny. That's my coping mechanism in a way, is to be like, oh, that's funny, even though it's not. So with the joke I just gave, which is a poorly tasted, you know what I mean? Like, for me, I'm like, oh, that's kind of funny, because it's effed up, like a lot of people's lives are. But like, humor for me,
You had to
like,
be there.
yeah, you had to be there, yeah. Humor for me is like I don't consider myself to be a funny writer at all. Like I just look for moments where I can be like, oh, I would laugh, like this seems like a good place in a story where I could like tease out something, right? And a lot of people don't know how to react to stuff. Like Burn, I think is a really funny story. Yet I'll read it and like nobody laughs. Like I get to the part where Dee says to Fellas, he goes, "I never thought I'd scalp a fellow tribal member before." That's funny. Like that I think that's a funny line. And nobody laughs. So I have to go, "You can laugh." And then everybody starts laughing at it. But yeah, I think we just need to be a little bit more reverent. I think we need to revere the irreverence, however that works. I'm just sort of rambling now. I'm trying to come back from after having just canceled myself with that poorly.
We'll get your own grave.
Yep. Good thing I'm going to Sherman Lexi's workshop.
How to dig your own grave.
Burn is funny, it's funny, burn is
By
funny.
Sherman and Lexi.
Brendan, do you wanna add anything, or are we?
No,
No?
You don't want to dig your own grave now?
mm-mm. I already did.
You're the only one who's hasn't.
Who, me?
Yeah, like I screwed everything up and he's like, oh, he's not gonna say anything, so yeah.
You can read, this is the last question and everyone can put the shine on it, so then, and everyone will forget whatever you screwed up or didn't screw up. This is the last question. This question is about how people have responded to your books and your films. And I think this person wants to know more about how people in your own communities responded to your books and your films, your peers, your elders. What has that been like?
I thought this might have been like a trait of Navajo mothers, but it might just be a motherly trait. Where you don't get a whole lot of compliments, you know? Like they're afraid to show their full emotions for you. They just like to criticize everything you do. Is that just an every mother thing, or? As I showed you on the screen, I have 8 mothers. That's why I'm all messed up. Where was I going with that? Oh, yeah, so when I was at the Tucson Book Festival a couple weeks ago, and my mom is just, out there hawking books. And it's like, Mom, I have a publisher who does this stuff. You don't have to sell these books. And she's like, she orders books online. She's buying them full price. It's like, Mom, I can get you a box of books from the publisher. And then when I'm sitting in line signing books at the festival, and everyone who came up to the table said, I just met your mom. So I know that she supports me, but she hasn't told me yet.
No, I'm good. All right.
Going in order, okay. Well, every time I go over there now, spit at me. I barely make it off alive. No. I mean, the Penobscot Nation, I feel like, has been overwhelmingly supportive and loving and caring about the book, and has like always rooted for me. I'm just like looking at Bree in my peripheral over there. Has always supported me. I don't think without that community, I would be, where I am, with the generosity of like just people in general who helped and who know like, my backstory and those types of things. But yeah, there's been an immense amount of love and support. My sister loves the book a lot. I mean, unfortunately, my father passed away in 2012, and my mom passed away in 2001. So neither of them got to ever really read my work. But my sister always just says, "Oh, you wrote mommy to a T." So I guess I don't know, like my mom probably wouldn't have read it, but that's just how she was. She didn't like to read, but everybody's been really supportive of the book, and I feel like validated in a way that I contributed something, right? That didn't.
I still think
Yeah.
my mom hasn't read my book.
Oh, really?
If my parents read the book, they definitely don't know how to talk about it. And part of it is dealing with the death of their son. And I can't imagine what it's like for a parent to, lose a child. But yeah, I think that's probably hit too close to home for them to really talk about it. And they're not literature people.
But we'll say one thing for aspiring writers, if you write something and you're afraid to show it to your parents, you've probably written something good.
Yeah.
But I'll end there, that I think without the Penobscot Nation and the community and my friends and the structure that's over there, you know, I wouldn't be where I am today. And so it's like, thank you to them really, you know, for the support and everything. The book and the work I do is not for me, it's for, you know, my community, it's for me, it's for being in conversation with, you know, other literature, Indigenous literature, and even non-Indigenous literature as well, so.
So I'm like very early on in this process with the film. The way that documentary films and films in general work is, you know, you have a premiere at a film festival and then you have a run at film festivals. And then eventually it ends up, if you're lucky enough to get distribution on streaming and in theaters. So our documentary Sugarcane has had its sort of premiere at the Sundance Film Festival and is now on the festival circuit. We brought it back to show to participants. So that's the documentary film term for the people who are in the documentary, as well as to the Chief and Council of the Williams Lake First Nation, which is a neighboring First Nation to my own, but not the one that my family is from specifically. And they all, you know, really love it, really support it. You know, from my dad and I, I'm both a director and a participant in the documentary. As I mentioned briefly in my talk, my dad is born at that residential school. And so one of the storylines in the school is sort of us figuring out more about the circumstances around his birth, which is a very painful story. And, you know, in addition to having the opportunity to live with my dad for the 2 years during the making of that documentary, as well as while I've been working on my book, you know, he was really proud to, as I mentioned, he's an artist, you know, he was really proud to actually, in our own way, get to actually collaborate on something creative, you know, like collaborate on a work of art in a different kind of way. You know, my dad's a carver, but he left when I was a little kid, so he never taught me how to carve. And once in a while, I'll like pick up an adze around him, and he'll like tease the shit out of me for it, and I won't try it again for a few months. So, you know, it was really meaningful for us to have that journey experience of life together, and also I think he was really proud to make art together in a different way than he does, but in this way that I do now. You know, it's still unfolding, and you know, the weight of nonfiction is that it's real people, you know, it's real people with real lives, and it's my family in this instance. And so, you know, that's something that scares me, right? Because this documentary eventually is going to be on Disney Plus, you know, which is kind of a crazy thought to know that like some of your family's most painful, traumatic experiences, you know, are gonna be streamable for at least the next 25 years. So, you know, that's I guess that's my way of trying to tell another genocide joke. But yeah, so that's it's a combination of, you know, I feel really grateful for the experience of making it and the life, and it's also been really well received so far. But you know, in nonfiction, I think it's a little bit different. And then, you know, in my life as a writer, of course, my book's not out yet. But I don't really expect that many of my family members to like read it, and it doesn't bother me at all if they don't. I mean, my mom reads all my stuff, which I'm really grateful for. And you know, my dad and some of the close people probably read a lot of it. My sister, a few aunts and stuff who were readers, but you know, the rest of my family's not really readers. That's not really their thing. And that's totally fine to me. You know, like to me, it's more important for me to be able to relate to my family and my community and my nation just as like another person in that nation. And it is a little bit weird now sometimes to, especially now there's this documentary out in the world, to go back home and to like be seen as like, oh my God, you know, you're our cousin who's like, you know, at the Sundance Film Festival or whatever. And like, that's not who I want to be in life and not who I want to be to them. So, you know, I actually try not to relate to them primarily as like a writer or a filmmaker or anything like that. I just try to be like, you know, they're fun, cool brother, cousin, nephew, you know, uncle, whatever, all that.
And I just want to add, that even if we're not literary or part of the literary community, there are other ways to support your family, your members of your community. I mean, you don't have to read and understand anything that we write. You don't even have to buy the book, but that would be helpful. But there are other ways to be supportive of someone who. I mean, I'm like you guys. I'm very grateful for the kind of support that I got from my family, even if it wasn't a necessarily a literary one. I want to say that they believed in me this whole time, but that's not true. They believed in the concept of me, I guess. I was conceived after all.
Wow. Well, that's it, folks. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Morgan, and thank you, Julian. Thank you for your words. Thank you for your art. Thank you for being here with us. And thank you all for your questions. Those are great questions.